The cornfield behind my uncle's farm wasn't normal. I grew up in rural Iowa, where cornfields are as common as dirt roads. My uncle owned a farm just outside of town, and every summer my cousins and I would spend weeks there helping out with chores, riding the old tractor, and getting lost in the endless rows of corn. It was a dream for a kid, until the summer of 2008. My uncle was a practical man. He wasn't the type to scare us with tall tales or ghost stories. That's why his one rule always stood out to me. Never go into the cornfield after dark. He never explained why. "Just don't," he'd say, and we'd nod. We figured it was to keep us from getting lost or injured. Cornfields are disorienting, and at night, they're a labyrinth of shadows. But looking back, I realized there was something else in his voice when he told us to stay out. It wasn't just caution, it was fear. One evening, my cousins and I were sitting around the fire pit behind the house, roasting marshmallows and swapping stories. The air was sticky with summer humidity, and the cicadas were loud enough to drown out most other noises. It was one of those perfect country nights, the kind that makes you feel safe, until the rustling started. It was faint at first, just a whisper of movement from the field. We all paused, thinking it was the wind, but there wasn't a breeze that night. The corn stalks were still, yet the rustling continued, slow and deliberate, like something, or someone, was moving between the rows. "Probably just a raccoon," Jake said, grabbing the flashlight he always carried. Jake was the oldest and had a habit of being overly confident, sometimes to the point of stupidity. "I don't think we should," I said. "Uncle told us." Jake rolled his eyes. "Oh, come on, you scared? It's probably nothing." The others were already on their feet, curiosity outweighing common sense. I didn't want to be the coward left behind, so I reluctantly followed. We stood at the edge of the cornfield, the flashlight beam cutting through the first few rows. The rustling had stopped, and the silence was unnerving. The field felt different at night. The tall stalks, so harmless in the daylight, seemed menacing now, like they were closing in. Jake took the lead, pushing his way into the rows. The rest of us trailed behind, each step slower than the last. The deeper we went, the quieter it got. The usual hum of insects and distant frogs faded until there was nothing but our breathing and the crunch of dry earth underfoot. That's when the smell hit us. It was sudden and overwhelming, sharp and sickly sweet, like rotting meat mixed with something metallic. My stomach churned, and I heard Sarah gag behind me. "What the hell is that?" she whispered. Jake didn't answer. His grip on the flashlight tightened, and I could see the beam shaking slightly as he swept it ahead. The rustling started again, louder this time, and closer. It wasn't random, like an animal scurrying. It was rhythmic, steady, like footsteps. "Jake, maybe we should go back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't reply. He just kept moving, pushing deeper into the field. I wanted to grab his arm and drag him back, but I was frozen, torn between fear and the need to see what was making that noise. Then we saw it. At first, it looked like a scarecrow, hunched over in the middle of the row. Its silhouette was tall and thin, too thin, with arms that hung awkwardly long at its sides. Jake raised the flashlight, and the beam caught it fully. It wasn't a scarecrow. The thing's skin was pale and stretched tight over its bones, almost translucent in places. It was covered in patches of what looked like dried mud or blood. I couldn't tell. Its head was bald and featureless, like someone had smoothed over its face with clay. We stood there frozen, staring at it, and then it moved. The thing jerked upright, its limbs bending at unnatural angles as it turned toward us. A low clicking sound started, vibrating in the back of my skull. Its head tilted like it was studying us, even though it had no eyes. Sarah screamed, and that was all it took. We ran. I don't remember the details of how we got out of the field. I just remember the sound of the thing crashing through the stalks behind us faster than it should have been. The corn scratched at my face and arms as I pushed through, my lungs burning, my heart pounding in my ears. When we finally burst out of the field, my uncle was standing on the porch, his shotgun in hand. His face was pale, but his eyes were hard. He didn't ask what happened. He just yelled at us to get inside. Once we were in the house, he locked the doors and pulled all the curtains shut. "What did you see?" he asked, his voice low and tense. Jake tried to brush it off, but my uncle wasn't having it. "Don't lie to me. Did it see you?" We all stared at him, too scared to answer. The next morning, my uncle took his tractor and flattened that section of the field. He didn't say a word about it, and we didn't dare ask. I haven't been back to that farm since, but I think about it often. About the thing in the field, the way it moved, the sound it made. I've done some research over the years, trying to figure out what it could have been, but I've never found anything that matches. All I know is that my uncle was right. Cornfields aren't just fields, at least not always. Sometimes they hide things we're not supposed to see. I grew up in the Midwest, surrounded by endless stretches of farmland. Cornfields were as common as streetlights in a city. By the time you're old enough to drive, those fields lose their charm, becoming just another part of the landscape. But one night, years ago, one particular cornfield turned into something I'll never forget, and I'll never drive past it again. It was late summer, sometime in August. The nights were still warm, but there was a faint hint of fall in the air, the kind that makes the hairs on the back of your neck stand up if you let your imagination wander. My best friend Liam and I were out for one of our typical late-night drives. It was our thing. Windows down, music low, just aimlessly cruising and talking about nothing. That night, the roads were empty, even more so than usual. We'd left the main drag and headed down one of those back roads that hardly anyone uses. It was one of those narrow stretches, bordered on both sides by towering cornfields that seemed to go on forever. The moon was out, casting enough light to see the road, but not much else. And there was a fog, thin at first, but thickening the farther we went. We were about 5 miles in when Liam suddenly told me to slow down. His voice wasn't panicked, but it had an edge to it, like he wasn't sure of what he'd just seen. I eased off the gas and glanced at him. "What's up?" He didn't answer right away, just nodded toward the cornfield on his side of the car. "Look out there," he said quietly. "Tell me you see that." I pulled the car over to the side of the road and killed the engine. The night went silent. No crickets, no rustling leaves. Nothing. That in itself was odd. Out there, you could always hear something. I leaned over, squinting through the passenger window at the field. At first, I didn't see anything. Just row after row of corn, the stalks swaying gently in the breeze. Except, there wasn't any breeze. Then I saw it. The stalks were parting, bending and snapping as something moved through them, something big. At first I thought it might be a deer, or maybe even a couple of them. But as I watched, my stomach tightened. Whatever it was tall, far taller than any deer. The corn was at least 6 feet high, and this thing was clearing it. I tried to make sense of it. A scarecrow being dragged? Someone pulling a prank? But my gut told me none of those answers were right. The thing stopped moving, just barely hidden by the last few rows of corn. I could see its silhouette, long and unnaturally thin. Its limbs looked wrong, like they were stretched too far, like someone had taken a normal body and pulled it apart until it didn't make sense anymore. And then it stepped out of the field. My breath caught in my throat. Liam let out this low, shaky sound, almost like a whimper. The thing was standing maybe 30 feet away, just at the edge of the road. Its skin was pale, almost luminescent under the moonlight, and its head, its head, was too small for its body, tilted slightly to the side like it was curious. Its eyes were dark hollows, and its mouth was stretched into this impossible grin, teeth glinting unnaturally sharp. We sat there, frozen, not daring to move. The thing didn't come closer, not at first. It just stood there staring at us, its head tilting from one side to the other, almost like it was trying to decide what to do with us. Then it raised one of its long, spindly arms and pointed at us. That broke me. "We need to go," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Liam didn't argue. I started the car, and the sound of the engine seemed to set it off. It lunged toward us, its long legs covering the distance between us faster than anything I'd ever seen. I slammed my foot on the gas, and the car shot forward, gravel spitting out from under the tires. It chased us. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw it keeping pace with the car, its limbs flailing but somehow precise, almost mechanical. Its grin never wavered, and its eyes, those empty pits, stayed locked on us. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the car on the road. The chase felt like it went on forever, but in reality, it was probably less than a minute. Suddenly the thing stopped. It skidded to a halt in the middle of the road, its head snapping toward the cornfield. Without warning, it bolted back into the stalks, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. We didn't stop driving until we were back in town. Even then, we sat in the car for a long time, parked under the flickering light of a gas station, trying to process what had just happened. Neither of us wanted to say it out loud, but we both knew what we'd seen wasn't human. For weeks, I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still out there, waiting. Liam and I avoided that road completely. Then about a week later, a local farmer found his dog mutilated in that same cornfield. The news blamed it on a coyote or maybe a bobcat, but I knew better. Liam knew better. Even now, years later, I still think about that night. Every time I pass a cornfield, I catch myself scanning the edges, half expecting to see that thing standing there grinning at me. I haven't told many people this story. Most wouldn't believe it, and honestly, I wouldn't blame them. But I know what I saw, and I know I'll never set foot near that road again. This happened last fall, and it's something I've tried not to think about. Even writing it out feels weird, like I'm inviting it back into my life. But maybe sharing it will help me understand it, or at least make it feel less real. I live in the Midwest. If you've been here, you know it's all flat land, endless skies, and cornfields as far as the eye can see. Growing up, you hear stories about cornfields, how they're haunted or cursed. People say weird things happen in them, but I always laughed it off. They're just tall plants, right? Nothing scary about that. I wasn't laughing last October. A friend of mine, Eric, runs a family corn maze. It's a big Halloween attraction. They go all out. Scary music, fog machines, people in costumes jumping out to scare you. The whole thing. One Friday night, Eric invited me and a few friends to come hang out after closing. "You'll love it," he said. "We'll scare some people, close up the maze, then chill by the fire pit with some beers." Sounded like a good time. And honestly, it was, for most of the night. The weather was perfect, cool, a little misty, with a bright full moon lighting up the fields. We spent hours helping out, jumping out at teenagers and laughing as they screamed and ran. Around 11:30 p.m., the last group left, and Eric asked us to do a quick sweep of the maze. "Just to make sure no one's still in there," he said. The maze was huge, 50 acres, with narrow paths and tall corn that made it easy to get lost. Eric handed us flashlights and told us to split up to cover more ground. I got the farthest section, near the tree line. I didn't mind at first. It was peaceful in a way, the soft rustle of the corn, the crunch of my boots on the dirt path. Every now and then I'd call out, "Hey, the maze is closed. If you're in here, let me know." No answer. About 10 minutes in, my flashlight started flickering. I smacked it a couple of times, but it just went out. Great. I pulled out my phone for light, but the battery was suddenly at 1%. It had been fully charged when I got there. That's when I noticed the silence. It wasn't normal. There were no crickets, no wind, no rustling, just this heavy, oppressive stillness. the kind that makes your stomach tighten, like your body knows something's wrong before your brain does. I was about to head back when I heard it. A voice. It was faint, almost a whisper, coming from deep in the corn. "Help me." I froze. It didn't sound like one of the actors. It was too weak, too desperate. "Where are you?" I called out. No answer. I thought about leaving, but what if someone really needed help? So I stepped off the path, pushing through the stalks. The leaves brushed against me, dry and brittle. With every step, it got colder. I could see my breath, which didn't make sense. It wasn't that cold outside. The voice came again, closer this time. "Help me." I finally spotted something crouched in the dirt. At first I thought it was a person. They were hunched over, their back to me. But as I got closer, I realized something was off. Their arms were too long, thin and stretched in a way that didn't seem natural. Their fingers were digging into the ground, pulling at the dirt. I tried to speak, but my throat felt tight. Are you okay?" I managed to say. The figure froze. Slowly it turned its head to look at me. Its face wasn't human. It was pale and smooth, like wax, with hollow pits where its eyes should have been. The mouth stretched unnaturally wide, filled with sharp, jagged teeth. It let out a low, clicking noise, like an insect. I didn't wait to see what it would do next. I turned and ran as fast as I could, crashing through the corn, not caring if I tripped or fell. Behind me, I could hear it following, fast, heavy, crashing through the stalks. When I finally burst out of the maze, Eric and the others were waiting by the fire pit. "What happened?" Eric asked, his face pale. I tried to explain, but I was out of breath and shaking. They didn't believe me, of course. They thought I'd spooked myself or run into an animal. "Maybe it was a deer," one of them said, laughing. But I wasn't laughing. The next morning, Eric and I went back to the spot where I'd seen it. I wasn't expecting to find anything, but the ground was torn up, like something had clawed at it. And there were footprints. Huge, elongated ones. Eric swore he didn't have any actors in that part of the maze. To this day, I don't know what I saw. I've told myself it was a prank or a trick of the light, but deep down, I know it wasn't. I haven't been near a cornfield since. Sometimes late at night, I still hear that clicking sound. What do you think? Was it a weird animal? A spirit? Something else entirely? I don't know. But I can tell you one thing. I'll never go into a cornfield again.